First of all, it's a pleasure to be here. I'm always reminded of why all of us live in California on the drive over. When you leave kind of crowded Los Angeles and then, 35 minutes later, you're in these beautiful mountains coming across to the Central Valley, and then looking across the valley as you come down. I always think back to, what it must have been like, 200 years ago, 150 years ago, when people came across in covered wagons, and they came across the Great Plateau area after coming through the Rocky Mountains, really the deserts of Utah and Nevada, and all of a sudden they come across the Sierra, which is a tough deal, and then they look down into the Central Valley. It must have looked like paradise to people. And I think we often forget how attractive California is. So I'm going to do an economic forecast. I've been told I have more time than usual. So I'm going to do a couple things a little bit differently, if you don't mind. And I'm going to talk a little bit personally about a couple of things, if I might. And what might help me is to understand a little bit about all of you in the audience here. How many of you have been in real estate for less than 3 years? Anybody? Well, welcome. We're glad to see you. You picked a good time to come into the business. And how many of you have been in business for more than 20 years? Okay, a lot of you. So you've seen a lot. And the thing that I think we have to recognize is that even though this market is recovering, and I'm going to give you an optimistic forecast, I'll tell you right now, the forecast is optimistic. The damage that was done to the economy is still around, because even though things are getting better, the market actually should be even better than it is. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that, but I'm also going to talk about something that's very, very personal for me. And I hope for many of you, and that's what you really do. Because what realtors do is not just, you're not selling a product as such. You're selling something that is really important. You're selling home ownership. And what you do really matters. And I can tell you a personal story. Any of you first generation Americans? Okay, so I am. And the story that I think I'm going to tell you, because I think it's kind of in jeopardy at the moment, is really the story of home ownership. And I'll use my family example. My parents came to this country 3 years before I was born, 1948, after sitting in displaced persons camps in Europe for 3 years. Nobody wanted them. They had to get out of Germany, having been in concentration camps. And it took them 3 years, and they came to the United States. And they were older. My dad spoke with a real thick accent. My mother they both spoke English well, but they had very thick accents. My dad lied. He told people he was 38. He was actually 41, because somebody had told him, if you're 40, you can't get a job in the United States. And he did get a job. He got a job, but he working in a warehouse. And he had been a union representative in Germany part of the war and everything. But in the U.S., all he could do was work in a warehouse, and he worked in a warehouse for 30 years. And my mother, who had been a teacher in Germany, ended up, by the time we were old enough, she went to work as a cafeteria worker for the the LA Unified School District. But the story I want to tell you is kind of twofold. The one thing I remember as a real small kid is we lived in an apartment. It wasn't even an apartment, it was called a court. It was in Santa Monica. And when I think back to it, as a kid, I remembered it being big. But I do remember something really bad about it. I had to share a room with my sister, who was 3 years younger than me. And she was crying all the time. And when I go back to that area today, that apartment we were in, which was a one-bedroom apartment, was about 575 square feet, if that. And the area that looked so big was really a 100 by 200 foot lot with 6 units on it. So one of the things I remember very, very distinctly is getting our first house. And I was 5. We got a house in Mar Vista. It was a big deal for me because I got my own room. And I got to paint it blue. And it was I thought it was a palace. That palace, by the way, was about 900 square feet. 3-bedroom, 1-bath, Kaiser home. Anyone know Mar Vista? Yeah, it was right near Douglas the Douglas plant in Santa Monica. And Kaiser Industries had built it out of quarter-inch plywood. But it was a palace. And my parents got that house because they got a reparation payment from the German government. And they used that money for a down payment and got an FHA 4 3/8 20-year loan. And I got to tell you, it made a huge difference. I mean, that's what they wanted to do. They had talked about it. They got a house. But beyond, you know, and that made them homeowners. That gave them a bigger stake. They already were invested. They had a huge stake in what they did. But back then, you know, they were lucky. They did get some help. They got reparations, as I say, that helped them make the down payment. But back then, someone who worked in a warehouse and had two incomes, you know, a cafeteria worker income, could buy a home in West LA. That house today in Mar Vista, first of all, it's been doubled in size like everything else in the neighborhood, but basically the median price in Mar Vista today is pushing $800,000 or $900,000, I would say, for that kind of home. It's a very nice, you know, it's a nice part of LA, but they're not the nicest, the largest homes. Someone in my parents' status couldn't do that today. And as I was working out this morning for a little while before I jumped on the freeway to get here, I read in the paper, some of you may have seen it, that the homeownership rate in the United States has dropped to the lowest level in 19 years. And in California, our homeownership rate is now well below 60%. And there's some people who think if we don't start changing things, it could drop as low as 50% or less in the state of California. And I guess what I want to talk about is that, the threat to home ownership, but I also want to talk about the fact that you make a difference principally in home ownership, but I need to share another story with you because it's related to this, on what realtors do. When you're just doing your job and trying to make a living, you also do good things generally, and I personally believe you do good things for people, generally. And again, my parents' story. So after 4 or 5 years, I still remember this, the two realtors, one was a friend of theirs, had this very similar background and experience, and another was the local realtor who was actually the listing agent on the house they bought. They used to sit in the kitchen and they'd be beating my parents up in a nice way. You got to buy investment property. You really have to buy investment property. And over the course of the next 10 or 12 years, when my parents would get a reparation checks, and these checks would be like $5,000 or $10,000 every 5 or 6 years. You know, that's for having spent years in a concentration camp, having been thrown out of your teaching job long before then. They gave them reparations. They made 2 purchases, actually 3. They bought 3 houses in West LA because these realtors twisted their arms. I mean, they really beat them up to do it. Those 3 houses made a huge difference. One of them, my dad kept for about 30 years. He kept it until a cousin of mine who was down on his luck was able to get out on his own. And he rented it to this cousin. Even, I'm going to say it was 2005, that cousin was paying $650 in rent to my parents. It was a home when he left that we sold for about $800,000. The other 2, they just rented in the marketplace. And they did very well. It's West LA. And as a result, my parents, who quite frankly, you know, my dad never made, I don't think he made $10,000 a year. His Teamster pension was $117 a month, if you can imagine. But because of those real estate investments, they had a really good retirement after having lost everything, being displaced. And the point I want to make here is that what you do really matters. And what we do collectively to ensure home ownership, to ensure the ability to own property, to ensure that that property allows you to be comfortable in your retirement, or for that matter, to take care of a family member who's down on his luck. It really, really matters. And I think what's important right now, although I'm going to give you a good forecast and a positive one because things are going the right way now, is that I think we're at a really important point in terms of the long-term history of housing in the United States. Because housing has been part of the American dream. It's not accidental that people got into housing. Housing was something that was seen as worthwhile, and government policies wanted to get people in housing, right? You know, my parents got into housing because of the FHA program. How many of you used FHA loans, either for yourself or for your clients. Those, they make a huge, huge difference. Or for that matter, almost every other loan, which is a Fannie Mae or a Freddie Mac, a GSE type loan, is because the government sees that there's an important role in housing. And they see in particular that homeownership is really more valuable in some ways than renting. Because one, more than anything else, homeownership provides a basis generally, whenever we look at it, for a much higher level of financial success, a much higher level of educational attainment, a whole series of things that help communities. And I guess when I looked at that number saying the first time in the lowest homeownership rate nationally in 19 years, and I look at some of the things that have been going on and what's happened to the FHA, the discussions about getting rid of Fannie and Freddie, that the House Financial Services Committee actually passed a bill that effectively would have gotten rid of them as meaningful entities. I think we're really at a crossroads. And so although I'm going to talk most of the time about the economy and all the good things that are happening, and I think the potential for this market to recover, I want you to keep in mind that I think we have a commitment. And that commitment is to work collectively to make sure that essential cornerstone of the American dream on home ownership is really supported. And I think we need to repledge ourselves to affordable housing. Because again, the thing that has really happened in this marketplace, in the American economy generally, for the last 5 to 10 years, and even I could argue longer than that, is you've had a polarization. If you're a heavy equities investor, the last 5 years have been the best years of your life. If you're in the stock market, it's been incredible. And if you're not, for that matter, you've seen the great masses, the middle class, have seen their buying power, their position go down. And they've seen more and more insecurity than they've seen probably any time in the last 30 years. I could argue even since World War II. And I would like to argue that a lot of this is what's happened in the home ownership market. And so I think we've got a job to do, and I know you've got plenty on your plate just taking care of your clients. But I also want to encourage you to engage in the debate about housing. Now, nobody's going to be talking about the fact that the home ownership rate's going down. We talk a lot about other things. We're worried about education, rightfully, right? We're worried about how much we pay in taxes. We're worried about the world situation. But to me, if you lose home ownership, you lose something that's really, really important in terms of the American dream and in terms of what this country stands for. So with that in mind, let's talk about where we are economically and what's going to happen and hopefully what we can do to create further success. So I'm going to talk about the economic outlook. I'm going to talk about California. I'm going to talk about housing affordability. I'll talk a little bit about your regional market. Let me just say your regional market is outperforming the state. I hope you know that, and God knows you deserve it out here because you've had a rough ride when we go back 5 or 6 years, obviously, 7 years. And I'll talk about the forecast for next year, which I already told you is going to be an upbeat forecast. And I have to preface this. I'm no longer officially an economist, but I get to do this every few weeks. And I think all of you know what an economist is, but I just want to remind you if you don't. It's someone who's good with numbers, but doesn't have the charisma to be an accountant. So keep that in mind as I go through these numbers. And again, there's a lot of charts here. I hope to have some time to get into a dialogue with you. It's a small enough group. But I think the charts do tell a story. And again, those of you who've been in business since 2007, 8, and 9, you really survived. All of us survived what was the biggest downturn in American economic history since the Great Depression. It doesn't even look that bad when you look at it, but 2009 was the largest drop in the GNP that we've seen since 1938. But what made it worse, quite frankly, not just that drop, what made it worse is the kind of downturn it was. It was a financially induced downturn. And when you have a financially induced downturn, it does things beyond what the normal recession, right? What it does, in fact, is it destroys not only the current basis for economic growth, it destroys a lot of accumulated wealth. So those of us who survived this, all of us who survived this, probably didn't realize at the time. It seemed pretty bad, and I know it seemed really bad here because you guys had a housing overhang, your prices came down a lot, but it was actually worse than we thought. And if there's anything we should be surprised about, it's that we've recovered as much as we have. It actually was a surprisingly positive recovery. Now that doesn't make us feel any better because it should still even be better than it is, and I'll talk about that. But what we've seen since then is that the economy has gotten better. It hasn't been very consistent, right? Now, if you look at some of these drops, some of them were weather, for the most part. The drop early this year, it was just an incredibly bad winter. I don't know how many of you were back east earlier this winter, but I got stuck in Chicago 3 times because the planes just couldn't leave Chicago. There was just no way to do it. And you'd go out on the street and there wouldn't be a soul there. I mean, it was just too cold. I mean, you'd stick your head out and there was no one out on the street. So, some of that is that. Some of it also has been bad economic policy. When the government, gets shut down, it doesn't lead any of us to be very, very confident, does it? By the same token, you've got a lot of bad news in the world as a whole. That also makes us less confident. But if you look at it, it's very clear that we've also had a long recovery. This is, the average recovery is usually about 7 years. This one's going to go longer than that. It already has gone longer than that. But what you also see when you look at those numbers is it's not the normal recovery. Normally, after a downturn, you have very sharp growth, really high growth, usually 5 or 6%. We never even got to 5 or 6%. And it's usually then starts slowing down. But because of the nature of the downturn, that financially driven one, this one's a little different. Growth is actually as good, if not better now, 6 years out, than it was in the first couple years after the downturn. And that's abnormal. But it takes that long for confidence to come back. And we're starting to see it. The consumer confidence number yesterday was the best one since the recession, actually. And so I think that's one of the reasons why I think we can expect to see the economy and housing do better. But again, we're just not growing as fast as we can. We're not growing as fast as we should, and it's been a bumpy ride. The real factor that I think hurt everyone was, of course, unemployment. The unemployment rate in California, which is always higher than the U.S. rate, approached 12%. But it's not, if you really think about that, it's not the fact that 1 out of 8 people are unemployed. That's terrible. That's bad. I mean, that's obviously, it's how much that scares all of us. And if you think back 5 or 6 years ago, even if you weren't unemployed, even if you had a good job, you'd been there for 8 or 10 years, you were worried that you could become unemployed. And that's what really has hurt the marketplace again, looking backwards. And it's only now that I think people are getting more confident. When we try to hire people, CAR is an unusual organization. The composition of the staff at CAR is really weird. We have 25 lawyers out of 125 people on the staff. And for the last few, can you think of anything worse? No, I'm kidding. I love my lawyers. But anyway, we have 25 lawyers. And what's really been interesting is until the last year or so, when we would advertise a legal position, because one of the things we've done at CAR is we know when the market's good. You guys don't need us. Everything's great. You hang up a sign, it sells, right? It's when you got a bad market that CAR tries to get involved to protect bad legislation, to assist you if you're dealing with a tough situation like a distressed property situation is almost always tough, especially short sales. We did 100 to 1,000 short sale calls, legal calls over the course of 18 months. So we staffed up a little bit in the legal area during the downturn. Well, I would put an ad out 4 years ago for an attorney. I'd get a stack this big. Never seen it before. And we don't pay our attorneys well. I mean, now what we do offer them, we don't pay them badly, but what we do offer them is a 40-hour-a-week job. Unlike, the 120-hour-a-week job some attorneys do. And we've gotten the best attorneys we've ever had. We've gotten people from incredible law schools, which we couldn't normally compete for in the past. So the job market, until the last year or so, was incredible in terms of hiring attorneys. We also have a big tech staff. In my introduction, one of the things we do is we run zip forms. How many of you use zip forms? All of you better say yes. But zip form is actually one of the reasons CAR hasn't had to raise our core dues since 2002, because we have 600,000 users of zip forms nationally. We have a staff of 60 people who are technologists. mostly developers who write the code. This stuff is not easy, and we have a lot of people around there who support it. And the same thing, it's actually headquartered in Detroit. We've left it in Detroit because it's a lot cheaper to operate in Detroit. But we could get, until recently, when I would go to Detroit, we would have 50 cars in our lot, and then all around us, which is an industrial part of Detroit, would be vacant. There'd be 4 cars. And over the last 3 years, you go by the, anybody live in Detroit? Anybody know Detroit at all? Some of you did, Linda does. You go by the plants, and they would be doing 1 shift with almost no one there. You go by today, they're doing 2 and sometimes 3 shifts, and the plants are full. So the employment base is changing and changing dramatically. And now, more importantly, even though it changed probably 2 or 3 years ago to a degree, I think people have confidence about their jobs, and they should, by the way. The reason you should be confident if you're in the labor force is, in a large degree, the labor force is going to contract. Now, again, there's all sorts of threats in terms of, exporting jobs. We've seen that. It's a concern. We know the technology is going to eliminate a lot of jobs. We can all be replaced by robots. But the reality also is that there's going to be a huge number of people, the baby boom generation, are going to be retiring. And the job market, which for 30 years has been a generally slack job market, you've had more bodies in many ways to fill jobs. If you look out 10 or 15 years, and assuming you're not devastating jobs because of technology or outsourcing, it's actually going to be a much tighter market for jobs. And I think people can be more confident. And as that confidence builds, it's going to lead, in my view, to a much more confident home buying public. And I think we're going to start, we've already started to see that. We'll see more of it. Again, this kind of shows that California is finally now catching up with the U.S. in terms of jobs. We still have a much higher unemployment rate, but the job market is now going from a strong, highly negative part of the economy to a positive one. And if you look at it by industry, you can start to see what's happened. I mean, who took it the hardest? This is what hurt Bakersfield so much. You were one of the few places in California where people were building, not only residentially but commercially. Construction, of course, plummeted. Construction is now coming back up. The services industries are coming back up, and even manufacturing is kind of holding its own. But again, for most of California, manufacturing is not going to do very well. But we expect to see, particularly the construction jobs and the service jobs, continue to grow. Now, if you look at it, jobs by industry, you can see what's happened. The strongest growth has been in construction. And again, that's one of the reasons you're outperforming the state as a whole. Administrative support and waste services, I always like that one. No matter how much we conserve, we create more waste. Information technologies, professional technical service, healthcare and social assistance, leisure and hospitality. Real estate, as you can see, is now a growth item at 2.1% growth. And then you can see the stuff that's going down. Finance and insurance has been going down. The lenders in particular have really shut down the number of jobs as the refi market has contracted, and as they continue not to want to make loans for reasons I don't understand. And the non-durable goods manufacturing. Government has also contracted. So you can see that if you look at these kind of jobs, there's 2 things that should jump out at you. One, from the standpoint of Bakersfield, because of construction, because of these other types of jobs, because you are a competitive marketplace, you're probably going to do better than most. You're not going to win at leisure and hospitality, but you are going to win in things like construction, administrative, information, obviously distribution of all sorts of goods, transportation, warehousing. Those are things that Bakersfield will perform well in. The other thing that it should jump out to you is that education makes a difference. When we look at the people who do well, both historically and looking out in the future, education really does make a difference. There's a whole series of studies. I won't spend a lot of time, but the extent to which you can improve your educational environments in any town in California or in the U.S. is the extent to which you actually improve your housing market as well. So I think that's important to keep in mind. If we look at the job trends for the metro areas, Bakersfield, it's performing at 1.7. It's not as strong, obviously, as San Francisco or San Jose. That's really where the growth is. Fresno is just coming up from a deeper hole, so they kind of caught up. In Sacramento, you had a resurgence again in some government hiring. But the fact of the matter is, you are in recovery after having a very, very sharp downturn. Now, if we look at the other items that are going on, the consumer is better placed. That's one of the reasons I think we can be optimistic about next year. If we look at the consumer price index, and I know it doesn't seem that way, the price index is pretty much under control. We don't have a lot of inflation. In fact, labor has been growing, the cost of labor, in other words, wages, have been going up at about 2 to 2.5%. And if you look at, and this is before we've really seen the impact of the drop in gasoline prices, inflation's been running less than 2%. So you're going to see a consumer who just has more money going into next year. And we're starting to see the impacts of that. If gas prices continue to be low, and we expect that they will be into most of next year, that's going to be a much better situation as well. And consumer confidence, 100 is what used to be defined as a confident consumer. Way back when. We saw that in 2005. And we plunged down to consumer confidence levels in the low to mid-20s. Now we're back up. The last one was well over 80%. This is cut short, I'm sorry. I should have added the last quarter and I didn't. And so we're getting back up. I have a pointer on this thing. I know I have a pointer here somewhere. Oops. Sorry. Okay, so we're getting back up. Let's see if I can do this right here, up to this level. And if there's one indicator that I think is a good one for you to look at when you're looking at your business for the next year, this is probably the best indicator. This says that consumers can be made to buy housing. So again, this is very much pointing in the right direction. Now, I don't want to be, Pollyannish about it either, because there's a lot of things that have to happen. We're looking at a preliminary estimate this year, because of that very bad first quarter, of about 2.2 to 2.5% increase in gross domestic product. That's not great. That's less than we saw in 2012. But again, if you take out that one quarter where you had bad weather, the rest of the year should be the strongest growth year we've seen in the last 5. And again, that builds confidence, that puts money in people's wallets and positions them. Non-farm growth, despite having that bad quarter, you can see it's up stronger than it's been since 2010 and before. The unemployment rate is shockingly low, and inflation's under control. So real disposable income, and again, this is people's buying power, that's up 2.6%. And so that, again, says you've got a consumer who is better positioned to buy anything, but also better positioned to buy real estate, and certainly is more confident. If we look at it from the California standpoint, you can see the numbers look very much the same. We actually have sharper growth in California income of 3%. And that means that the consumer is better positioned. The growth this year, when it's all said and done, will be the best since we came out of this recession. And so again, that's why we're optimistic. But we do have to explain something, and that's why this year wasn't as good as it could have been. You guys don't feel it much here, but I'll talk about that in a little while. So if we look at the housing market, clearly we're well on the road to recovering. Volume, and again, not here, but in the state, volume's down. And let me talk about that for a second. When we did our forecast last year for 2014, we thought the total overall sales in the state would go up about 6%. They actually are down about 8% for the state as a whole. That's not true here. You guys actually continue to grow. But what happened, what makes it worse, by the way, we also thought interest rates would be at 5% by the end of this year. And they're not even going to be at 4% by the end of this year. So not only were we had the interest rate forecast wrong, we thought people would continue buying even with high interest rates, and we were off. Now the problem that we have is a kind of a twofold problem, and you have some of this as well. If you look, 25% of the sales statewide were investor sales, mostly all cash investor sales. You still have investors here. It actually makes sense to be an investor in this marketplace. It no longer makes sense in most of coastal California, in my view. You cannot get a real cash return anymore. So we have to account for about a 15% decline. We'll go back to 8 or 10%, which is the normal pool of investors in a marketplace. So we have 15% of the market that is going to be washed out over a year or two. We have to make up for that. We have to make up for that generally with first-time buyers, quite frankly. And at the same time, the lenders continue to make it very, very difficult. The federal government has made FHA almost useless in a sense. It's actually better to go with private with a private mortgage insurance as opposed to FHA in most marketplaces. And as a result, we had this gap, this pause in the marketplace. And the last and most important part of it is we had this pause in the marketplace, and like I say, you haven't experienced it, but we had a pause in the marketplace because we came so far so fast that affordability, which was at the best levels we'd seen in 30 years coming out of this recession, is now becoming a real problem in much of California again. And it's going to be a continuing problem. And it's a problem that I think you're going to confront here as well. And so all of those factors created what we call a pause. I'll call it a pause in the marketplace. We're down slightly. In terms of gross dollar volume, in terms of gross commissions, the marketplace is actually still up. But in terms of the number of sales and the number of sales we should have had, we had about 380,000 sales, we think, by the time this year is done. But normally, if I told you interest rates were at 4%, if I told you the economy was growing at the fastest period in 5 years, if I told you that consumer confidence was the highest one in 5 years, quite frankly, we would have expected about 500,000 sales. So we're way short. And the reasons for it are affordability and underwriting. So we'll talk a little more about that. But and again, I think to me, this is very personal, quite frankly. You know, one of the things that we try to do is we try to get people into homes, you know, on our staff at CAR. One, we believe in it. Two, you know, it's obviously something that you guys do for a living. We want to support it. But it was two or 3 years ago, it was a once in a generation. I used to go out and say this. In fact, last time I was here, I said this. It was a once in a generation buying opportunity. And I thought that buying opportunity ended as a once in a generation. It's still a good buying opportunity. I thought it kind of ended about a year ago. But in fact, I think it's still a really incredible time to buy. And I think when you talk to your potential buyers, and I'll give you some stuff on this later, I don't know that we're doing a great job of selling home ownership. And part of it is because I think the government has made it, and you've got all this stuff about, you know, millennials, they want to rent forever. We just finished a survey. They don't want to rent forever. Nobody wakes up in the morning and says, I want to be a lifetime renter. That's just not the norm. But it's easy to rationalize when you have a lot of student debt, when you can't qualify because lenders are being unreasonable, and if you don't have a large down payment. So we'll talk a little more about that as we can. So again, volume's a bit down because we still have those investment sales there, but they are getting smaller and we need to replace them, and we haven't made that replacement switch. Inventory remains too tight. If we had more inventory, we'd have more sales. Your inventory in Bakersfield is historically tight. In fact, you know, in all the years I've come up here, the inventory for the last couple of years has been the lowest I've ever seen. It makes no sense in a sense because you can still develop. Pent-up unrealized demand is not yet translating to sales, but it will. And affordability challenges are starting to emerge. So if you look at the numbers, you can see exactly what I'm talking about here. These are the sales numbers for the state as a whole. This is, you know, 05 when we peaked. Almost 600,000 units. But if you look at the recovery period, this went way up. This is a huge component. At this point in the marketplace, we were at 70% distressed sales and about 35 to 40% investor sales, right? And the investors have been coming out slowly but surely, particularly these last year and a half. The investors have been coming out, and sales as a result have gone down. Now, we do think the marketplace will start to go to a traditional marketplace, in part because all these investor sales, what was on the other side of them? Someone who had to do a short sale or went through a foreclosure, right? And they're going to start requalifying again. And the demographics just generally. So the marketplace has not been as strong. We really, as I said, have seen periods where we sell, you know, this was, look, a lot of these people were just renting their homes. They just didn't know it, right? They found out the hard way, unfortunately, in many instances. But there's no reason why we shouldn't be back up here at 450 to 500,000 sales. And that's what I would anticipate over the next couple of years. You know, providing the government does the right things and you know, we don't get any exogenous types of shocks. So the multiple offers have declined in this marketplace. Again, you still have them, but you can see they're down. The percentage last year was 72% of all sales were multiple offers. Today they're at 53%, and the number of multiple offers are down. You still get, you know, those ridiculous stories out of Silicon Valley where there's 40 offers and the thing goes for $700,000 over the offering price. But by and large, the market is normalizing, and normalization is a good thing. There are fewer homes sold above the asking price in 2014. You can see 1 out of 3. That's down substantially from last year as well. You can see the number of homes sold above the asking price, you know, is also translates into a slightly longer median time on the market and a slightly larger median discount. You know, these are the types of things we track. I know many of you do this locally in your own farms to kind of track what's going on there. But you can see we're still in a marketplace. If you look at the long run average of 19% of sales being above asking price, we're still in a very good market beyond that. And again, here's investment is still 15% market share, down from 19%. And again, some of these numbers are not quite the right numbers. I'm not quite sure how we got those, because it was much higher than that. But you can see we do have to come down from these types of numbers. Oh, these are investors with financing. So now 9 out of 10 transactions are in fact equity sales. And again, you know, it's not been that long, as I said, where 60% of the market was an REO market in 2009 even. We were at 60% REOs, 30% equity, and 10% short sale. So you can see how far we've come here. But normalization and the damage that was done takes a long time. Takes a long time. So what you've seen in 2014, that this market continues to grow, I think is a very good sign for 2015. You can see distressed sales. You guys still have a much higher percentage of distressed sales here in the Central Valley. Sales are stronger in the upper price ranges than they've been in the past. You know, when we look at these prices, you can see the growth is the number of sales below 200,000 continues to contract as prices go up. If we look at it I'm sorry, I'm painting this thing a little slow here. But as we look at it, where the increases have been, you can see what's happened in the change in sales by price range. Your prices continue to go up, and people are now better positioned to pay for higher priced homes. Particularly what we're missing, by the way, is a real strong trade-up market. And that can't happen for another couple of years, but that should start to kick in over the next couple of years. Now, again, I showed you these numbers. You can see what's happened on prices. We had just a huge resurgence in price. We dropped 59%, this is a statewide number, 59% from the peak price in May '07 to the bottom in February '09. We dropped 30% a year for 2 years, basically. And now we've come back from $245 to a median price of $461,000 in September. Now, that's good news. People have recovered a lot of equity. It's one of the reasons, you know, at one point we were approaching 50% of the home owners in California being below water. Today that number is down to about 11% and dropping pretty quickly. Again, another sign of the market being strong. But you also have to look at those last 3 years here. When you went from a median price of below 300,000 very quickly to 460. This is one of the reasons, again, you've got that pause in the marketplace. That's a sharp increase any way you look at it. You've had prices go up by 80% in a 2.5 year period, really. And as a result, the pause, the breather we've seen in much of the state is explicable. And again, for you to have avoided that just shows you know, the advantages of affordability in this marketplace. You can see how it's gone, you know, in California versus the U.S. I mean, I think we sometimes forget this. The California market was, of course, as always, crazier, and it came down much harder, but it's also recovered much more steeply than the U.S. market as a whole. And that's why investors are willing to take bigger chances in California than they are in other marketplaces. I won't go through peak to trough, but you can see, you know, for the state as a whole, the peak to trough decrease was 88% for the state as a whole. And if we look at the Central Valley here, you know, you guys were down peak to trough 87%. That's that devastates people, particularly the most recent buyers, right? The recovery, has obviously mitigated a lot of that. Now, if we look at inventory, and again, we forget how quickly this is, but we had a statewide inventory of 16 months, and that was in 2008. And that was with the lenders holding all sorts of stuff off the marketplace, right? So remember that we used to talk about shadow inventory? Anyone remember that? And the shadow inventory never really showed up the way it was supposed to. But the fact of the matter is we could use a shadow inventory right now, because anytime you're below 4 months, and we continue to be right around the 4 months, or where we were last summer, when you were at a 2-month supply, that is clearly a seller's market. It's clearly a market that actually holds down sales because buyers have too few choices. Not to mention the fact when they're competing against all cash investment purchasers. And I know many of you have gone through this, where you've taken buyers and they've made 6, 8 offers and they just get fatigued and they just drop out of the marketplace, and you can't blame them under those circumstances. Well, it is getting better, but it's not getting better fast. And I wish I could tell you the inventory will go back up to the normal 6-month supply over the next year. I don't think so. Unfortunately, you have a lot of people who should be trading up, who either can't trade up or just aren't ready to do so yet. It's still going to take another couple years, but inventory situation's improving. And you can see how the inventory varies. The higher price the home, the larger the inventory generally. But the inventory really at all price ranges, below $1 million is constrained. That hurts sales. And I think one of the things, and I know you do this when you're talking to potential sellers, when you're going through your lists of people who might be in a position, anytime you've got an inventory below 4 months and you're willing to price it correctly as a seller, it's a good time to sell. It really is a good time to sell, and it's going to stay a good time to sell. And I think we can do a better job of explaining that to people. Now, why was the inventory so low? Well, the demand side we know, we've talked about it, and the supply side is there's no new construction. Even here in Bakersfield, where you guys were one of the highest producing areas in the entire state in terms of new housing, it's only slowly but surely coming back. Now, I do think we just need a lot more housing. Any way you look at it, we're going to need a lot more housing. Underwater home owners are stuck. As I said, that number is down to right around 10%. The mortgage lock-in effect, and this is one I do want to talk about. For most of my career, and as you heard, I've been doing this since the early 19th century. For most of my career, since really the early 80s, we've been on a long-term downturn in interest rates. I can remember, and I know many of you can too, I remember I was so happy. I got a 12% mortgage. I thought that was the best thing because the rate went right up to 14% really the weekend after I got locked in, and then went to 18% in 81 and 82. How many of you remember that? There's quite a few of you, okay. And then, mortgage rates came down, and the thing about mortgage rates coming down as they have for 30 years, it's a lot easier to leave your house when they're going down, right? But if you've got a 3 1/4, or a 3 1/2, 15 or 30, or even a 30-year mortgage at 4, and rates start going up, it's going to be a little bit of an issue for us, to say the least. You may not like your house, but you're going to love your mortgage at some point in the next 10 years, I predict. And so that's really good for, one of the things you might point out to people when you're talking to prospective buyers is, again, this house can be improved. You can add on to this house. The remodeling business is going to be a bigger deal 5 and 10 years from now than I think we recognize. And so getting houses with potential for making them larger may be of some value to a lot of buyers. It's something to think about. It's also going to be a challenge for us to get people out of those houses. Now, what I would argue, again, based on that personal experience I shared with you, having a house with a low mortgage rate, those are the best investments. You may not want to get rid of the house, but you might be better off using that as an investment and buying another house. But that's a transition that we're going to have to go through. But we are in a different environment. Foreclosure pipeline is drying up. All these things, investors are renting instead of flipping. Well, that's one of the things, again, we've probably forgotten about it, but when investors first came in the marketplace, everybody was worried about flipping, remember? Most investors are not flipping. There are some who are, and they're generally doing it by rehabbing houses. They're taking houses that were decimated during the downturn. But by and large, what we've seen is these large investment pools, they're in there for at least a 3 to 5 year period, maybe a longer period. So there's a big part of the housing stock that has been removed and put into the rental sector. Another reason why I think we're going to see inventory constrained over time. So what about housing affordability? As I said, I think this is really one of the biggest problems. It's the Achilles heel of the California economy. I talked about it, just generally, but why does Toyota go to Texas? Why do people go to Phoenix? Anyone spend a summer in Phoenix? You don't want to. I mean, it's not only hot, it's wet. I mean, it's like. It's but the fact of the matter is, if you're a business person, and I'll give you a quick personal story. Zip Forms, when we bought it, had a staff of 13. We had 17,000 customers, and now we have 16,000. We're up to a staff of over 60. My original intent was to bring it to California, right? That's where I live. I don't like flying to Detroit. In fact, I don't like driving in Detroit. But the fact of the matter is, if I brought it to Detroit. The software that you get in your dues costs less than $1 a month. Less than $1 a month. And we have one of the Zip Form directors here, in Jeannie Redsey. If we brought it back to California, our prices would increase about 40%. Just because of labor costs. And those labor costs are mostly because of housing prices. In the Zip Form staff buys houses for $150,000 that the California LA staff couldn't buy for $600,000. Now, it's Detroit. So that's the caveat on everything. If you spend a winter in Detroit, you know what I'm talking about. If you spend a summer in Detroit, you know what I'm talking about. But the houses are beautiful. Houses that we would kill for, that they walk away from. The incredible Victorians. But the fact of the matter is, as a business person, we're the California Association of Realtors. I can't bring the business to California without making the members pay for it. Says a lot. And it's the same reason Toyota and other big companies move out of California. And housing is a big, big portion of it. You talk to young people today and look at the housing impact, it's really significant. So we need to talk about affordability. And I think, again, in Bakersfield, you actually have affordable housing. I think this is going to be a long-term competitive advantage for you here in this area. And again, here's, this is what we know. This, at one point, believe it or not, in 1976, California housing was more affordable than housing in the rest of the U.S. Our price was about 4 to 5% higher, but our incomes were 7% higher. Today, when we compare it, you can see what's happened. Housing is affordability in the U.S. as a whole. I won't go into how we calculate this, is well over 50%, even though it's dropped in the U.S. as a whole. But we're back down now to the mid-20s range in terms of housing affordability. And again, it's still a lot better than it was. I think it's important to remember this. When we did these calculations in 2007, it was the housing cost calculator. This counts taxes, insurance. It's PITI plus, actually. It was almost $3,700. Even today, with everything, this is October. Actually, this is the second quarter. It's actually lower than this today, probably, because of interest rates going down. It's $2,300. So we're much more affordable from a payment standpoint. But if you compare that $2,300 and you use a normal type of calculation of 30% of income, it constrains a lot of people. So we've got an affordability problem, but we shouldn't exaggerate it either. It's not as bad as it was in 2007. But then again, if I show you this slide, are we surprised by what happened? We shouldn't be. And I think we need to be a little nervous as we get to this level as well. Not very nervous, but a little nervous that it doesn't happen again. And in 2000, I stopped trying to give speeches in 2006 and 2007. And the reason I did is because I kept telling everyone, so far we've been lucky. And the only way we could justify prices, and I used to tell people this, is, I can justify this price because I know what prices are in Hong Kong, Singapore, and Tokyo. That's not a good justification, because most people don't leave for Hong Kong, Singapore, and Tokyo. They leave for Las Vegas or Phoenix or Chicago. So again, qualifying income, which at one point was $146,000, $147,000, is still at $94,000. But look at that qualifying income. Now, even though it's down probably to $90,000 right now, how many people make $90,000? The average Californian doesn't make $90,000. They need help in qualifying. This is a struggle for us, and we have to realize it. And that's why affordability matters. Now, again, if we look at it from a payment standpoint, inflation adjusted, the good news is we're not that much worse than we were in the 70s if we adjust for inflation. That's why I think we should be optimistic. But the fact of the matter is affordability is a problem. And I can argue the minimum qualifying income today, because of interest rates, right, is the same as it was 35 years ago. But this is all because of interest rates. And so I think what we have to be careful is what happens when interest rates increase. Now, having said that, the good news is interest rates, which we thought would have increased this year, aren't increasing this year. I can even argue that they probably aren't going to increase next year. With Europe flat on its back, and they're doing everything they can to stimulate that economy. And the fact of the matter is there's a lot of money around, in large measure because the demographics of the U.S., there's a lot of older people. And older people tend to have more money. They tend to be net savers, not spenders. And as a result, I wouldn't be shocked, we're not forecasting this, but I wouldn't be shocked if we saw interest rates for the next 9 months pretty much where they are today. And they won't probably hit 5% next year. So that's the good news. But when interest rates start going up, and this is a conversation you should start having with your potential buyers, it's going to have a big impact. It's going to restrict the number of families here at 3.5%. You get 34 to 30, or 3.5 to 4%. You get 34 to 32% of households can buy. If you go up to 5%, that number is cut down to 26%, 27 or 26%. It's cut down by about 25%. And if you look at it, people don't really look at it that closely, but right now you're looking at a payment around $1,700. If it goes up to 5%, your payment's already up $300 a month. And these are the types of dialogues that I think it's important to start talking to your customers about so they understand what a great opportunity it is to buy. Like I say, housing prices are up, and that makes it less affordable, but the mortgage stays with you forever, right? It's a 30-year mortgage in most instances, a 15-year mortgage. If you can lock that in at a low price as a buyer, it's an incredible thing to do. And again, you can look at it in terms of the qualifying income that you get on a 20% down payment. So for all these reasons, again, I think it's a very good time to buy. And I don't know that we've done a good enough job convincing the public that. And I know the lenders are not being cooperative. And again, I can see it from, how many of you are lenders? Any lenders in here? Okay, so I know the problem lenders have. The biggest problem lenders have is the putbacks by Fannie and Freddie. Anything you've ever done wrong, they stuck it to you and stuck it to you really bad, and everybody's worried about that. And I can understand that. But by the same token, I also looked at the portfolios that were put back. And I'm sure none of you guys were involved in it, but those loans were not underwritten, pure and simple. It wasn't that they made a little mistake, they'd overlooked anything. The stuff that they had to buy back were just not underwritten. For the most part, they were liar loans, pure and simple. And again, if you're a lender, you don't want to ever be in that situation again. So what are they doing? They're not lending to Ben Bernanke, right? I mean, which is an overreaction. And then again, I'm not even sure that story's true, but it might be. And I do think the lenders are now starting to lessen the credit. Again, portfolio loans are actually cheaper than Fannie Freddie loans, and lenders who control their own portfolio are being more reasonable than Fannie and Freddie in a sense. So we're starting to see that loosen up, and I think it will. So when that loosens up, and you have that with a combination of low interest rates, again, I think that's something we've got to make sure the public understands. It is an incredible opportunity when you look at it that way. And again, all these numbers kind of point to the same thing. But the problem we've got here in the marketplace is because of what's occurring and the investors coming out, this number needs to be higher. This number of first-time home buyers, we're way, way low on the number of first-time home buyers. Now that's less true here, I suspect, than other places. But first-time home buyers are really our future. All of us who enjoy our housing and enjoy our housing prices need somebody to buy that house, because eventually we are going to leave that house. Some of us may leave our houses horizontally, but we are going to leave that house. One way or the other, we're going to leave it. And if there are no first-time home buyers, you can't sustain the housing prices we have, for that matter. Now, I do think this number will get better. I think there's a lot of reasons, that young people today are putting off adulthood. One, it's a great lifestyle to live with your parents. I mean, it's wonderful. You guys cook and clean for them, right? How many, no, I won't ask that question. I'm proud to say I have a 28-year-old and a 32-year-old, and they're on to their second houses, both of them, which makes my life easy. But what do we have to do about this? One, it's a constrained flow of new households in the housing market. Obviously, it's a problem. The trade-up market will never recover until that first-time buyer market recovers further. That's the other thing that I think we have to understand. And if we look at it between first-time buyers and repeat buyers, you can see the difference. If you can't get this person in at $80,000, you can't get this person at $120,000 moving. So we have a real interest in the continuity of the marketplace. Now, why do people want to rent instead of buying? The honest answer, really the only one that I really, think matters, is that you can't afford to buy, and that includes having poor credit. But very few people, if you look at this stuff, very few people say it's that they don't want to, right? They're saying they can't. And renting is easier, yeah. Young starting out, and if you're planning on moving, obviously in a short period of time, you want the flexibility and freedom. But the real problem here is that they can't afford to buy. And I think we need to keep that in mind. Now, student debt is also a problem. I don't want to say too much about it as being a huge problem, but it's perceived as a problem. It's perceived as a problem by the public. It's perceived as a problem certainly if you have a lot of student debt. This is holding people back. It makes it more difficult to qualify. I'll just make two observations if I could. Student debt makes sense if you go to a good institution of learning. In other words, if you're not going to one of those private schools that basically is going to make sure you get or do not get a fake degree but end up with a debt, that's a problem. But if you go to you go to Cal State Bakersfield, and you make that investment and you take a lot of student debt, it will still turn out better for you. We know that the income is going to be better. It's, again, for most students who go to real universities, student debt still makes sense. But it is perceived as a problem. And I suspect, how many of you have seen someone whose student debt just makes it impossible for them to qualify for a loan? Have any of you seen a lot of that? There's a little bit of that out there. There's no question. And what's sad about it is if they didn't come out with a degree, they didn't come out with the right kind of training that allows them to pay off that debt and have a brighter future. Most people actually do. And if you work with them, if you do the credit counseling, you work with them, they're going to be okay. But this is one of the problems in the marketplace. And it's certainly, when you look at it this way, it looks horrific, right? Except the problem is a lot of this is just wasted student debt, as I would say. It's student debt that to a large degree didn't result in a degree. And that's the kind of, or didn't result in appropriate training where you can go get an IT job. And it's pretty horrendous if you look at the numbers that go to these private for-profit schools who are so much under attack these days, and rightfully in my view. So home ownership rates, again, the U.S. home ownership rates, we haven't updated this one. We should. It's plummeting. As you can see, it's going to be down below the 1994 figure now. But California, that number is approaching 50%. And again, when we look at our future is how attractive of a place is California. For all reasons, it's incredibly attractive. We should all want to live in California. But if you can't make it affordable, if you can't make it something that people can do, we're going to pay a price, not only in terms of our lives as realtors and in terms of what we do, but in terms of the economy as a whole. And what's really distressing about this is, where is the home ownership rate falling? Well, overall, it's falling like this. But if you look at the oldest groups of Americans, in fact, you look at the baby boomers, they're doing it kind of okay. The sharpest drop is on the under 35s. And this will have a big impact on their financial position throughout their lives. And so again, one of the things I think we need to think about is tell the story of homeownership, but we also need to work with them. I know many of you do this, work with people to make it doable for them. You know, a lot of people just don't know how to get into homeownership. They could qualify for homeownership, or they could do something for a short period of time, 6 to 18 months, to get them to qualify for homeownership. Those are things we should look at, and there's an incredible number of government programs that go unused. You know, I'm not talking about just FHA or GSE loans. I'm talking about specialized programs that are designed for teachers, for firefighters, for government workers. There's just a lot of stuff out there that can get people into homeownership, and I think it's obligatory on us to learn more about these. So, you know, the millennial malaise is the homeownership rate. This is looking at 94 through 2014, the number of millennials who are buying homes, and you can see that that is a problem. When you know, part of this is the great financial depression of 2006 through 8 and 9 really hurt this generation overall. You know, there's a whole generation of college students who for 3 or 4 years could not get jobs. Now they're starting to find jobs, many of them, but the fact of the matter is, we need to be worried about this. We need to get them into housing. We need to make a concerted effort. And the good news when you see something like this, quite frankly, is they are going to get into housing eventually. This is really delayed demand, not demand that has disappeared. But it's our job to help them get in. So with everything going right, you know, the homeownership market, we got to be a little bit worried about it. It's still not pointed the right way in terms of homeownership. And again, you don't see it here so much because you have both, you have a fairly balanced construction market, but if you drive through LA, you will see a fair amount of construction. None of it, I shouldn't say none of it, almost none of it, single family homes for home ownership. Almost all of it is high-end, $2,000 a month plus apartments. And we need to be concerned because that isn't the society I think we want. So what do we need to do? We need to construct 165,000 units a year. We used to construct 330,000 units a year. And you know, Bakersfield has done its part. It will continue to do its part. It's really not your problem. You guys are open to growth. You understand the value of growth. This morning, again, you know, when I was reading this story about Malibu, where Rob Reiner, anyone, you know, the actor, wasn't he? What was his name? He was Archie Bunker used to call him Meathead, right? Anyway, Meathead has put an initiative on the ballot in Malibu, of all places, and they had this big debate between him and a developer who developed some very nice housing and is generally a good guy. And he, you know, the developer asked him, "Well, do you think it's fair to have a not in my backyard mentality?" And he says, "Not only is fair, that's why I'm here." And the fact of the matter is, everyone had that NIMBY, not in my backyard attitude, and it's very prevalent in this state. You'd never get any housing done, right? We're all in favor of housing in somebody else's neighborhood. But the fact of the matter is, if we don't address this, and again, this was a fascinating debate. I haven't quite figured out what I'm going to do with it, but I'm going to do something with it. We're never going to get enough construction. And again, as I say, people don't understand this is their personal problem. If they like, you know, if Rob Reiner likes his I don't know what he's got, $6-8 million home, and he wants it to stay at $6 to $8 million, he better have somebody moving into the neighborhood somewhere. You know? And if Rob Reiner cares about people watching his movies and his residuals on television, somebody has to get a job and they have to get housing, and it's better to be in California, obviously. So again, I think this is all of our problems. And here, again, here's the story. As I say, you know, this goes back to the 80s. When this was not our strongest year. In the 70s, we built more housing. But you can see where we've been. This is all, you know, this is why I think the future, if we look out, there's going to be bumps in the road. But people need housing. They're not going away. And they're going to hit the marketplace at some point, and we're going to have a further collision between affordability if we don't build more housing. And it's coming up, but it's not coming up anywhere near that 165 we think you need to have. So again, keep that in mind. I won't spend a lot of time here on the marketplace because you know this. You guys are outperforming. Your sales are actually up in Bakersfield, whereas, as I told you, we're down about 8% statewide. You're up 3.5%. Your median prices are almost twice what we're starting to see in terms of the state as a whole. Even, again, your inventory is even tighter. This is very unusual. Bakersfield's inventory often is 50% above the statewide average. So you've got a good, a good market here, and you're outperforming the rest of the state. You deserve it because you've had some rough times, obviously. I get that. I'm pretty optimistic about this marketplace. I forgot to stick in. I stuck in this slide. This is from Property Radar. This shows the number of bank-owned homes. But if I took this slide from 7 years ago, 6 years ago, it would have been a sea of red, right? This is still having this amount of distressed property is actually, in a sense, an advantage. One of the reasons you outperform. This is still a marketplace where investment can make sense. If I were looking in California, this would be one of the markets I would look to invest in, quite frankly. And you can see that these numbers are way down. They're a fraction of what they used to be. And they'll disappear more over time, which means your prices are likely actually to accelerate a little bit if nothing else changes. Delano, these are very small number of sales, but in each case, you're up year to year and your inventory is low. There are distressed properties there as a part of the housing mix. It's a reasonably high number of distressed properties. Taft, the same thing. Very low, but you're up, and you're up very sharply in all these areas. This marketplace will continue to recover. I think you're going to recover faster than the state as a whole. So when I give you this forecast, I would kind of be more optimistic. But our forecast for next year is that sales go up. Let me get them all up there. Sales are going to go up marginally next year. They're going to go up about 6%. We don't forecast regions, but I suspect you're going to go up more than that. And I think this is a conservative forecast. I think we can do much better than this forecast. We expect prices, however, to start to level in much of the sale. In much of the state, the price change, and this is a good thing. We need a pause in prices, and they will pause because of affordability. We'll only go up 5% next year. But again, this is a leverage investment, right? If you're doing a normal 20% down, this is a 25% return on your investment, and that compares pretty favorably with 1% on a CD, doesn't it? The Housing Affordability Index is going to continue to deteriorate. We're forecasting a slight increase in the fixed rate mortgages, but I could see that not even occurring. But even with that 4.5%, that basically means at the end of next year, rates are still going to be below 5%. But all bets are off when you get to 16 or 17. And again, I think when you talk to your potential buyers, this is a great time to talk to them about interest rates. It's a great time to show them the history of housing. It's a great time to explain to them, what happens. And increasingly, it'll be a great time to have a dialogue with your existing homeowners and talk to them about trading up as well, because a lot more of them will be in a position to do so. And again, I think there is a gun to everyone's head. And that gun to everyone's head is the fact that interest rates are so attractive and will start going the other way at some point. And it's, one of the problems we've had in the marketplace is there hasn't been any urgency, right? Because everybody keeps thinking rates are going to stay where they are. They're not. They're going to start moving, if not next year, by 2016. So again, I'm optimistic on this. I want to thank you for having me out. I hope I illuminated some of the issues. I'd love to take any questions, and it's a pleasure seeing everyone. I wish you best of luck. Thank you very much.
Anybody have any questions? What's your call on the government and mortgage?
Okay, so I think the mortgage deduction is, I don't think much is going to happen in the next 2 years. It can. My assumption is that the Republicans will take over the Senate. So you'll have a split government, which generally is good for not too much happening. But we've been good at that for a long time. The problem we have, I want to be very candid about it, is that the mortgage interest deduction is a huge outlay by government, number one, and both parties now have indicated they're willing to give it up. That's never happened before. Obama at one point and the Democrats said they would take a decrease down to $500,000, and then you had, the last Republican candidate. He said he would cap it at a total $10,000, which is much worse for us, by the way. We have, how it gets cut is actually more important for us in California as to what gets cut. I don't think it's going to happen in the next 2 years, but it could. When Clinton, the last 2 years of the Clinton's presidency, he had Republican majorities, both the House and the Senate, and a lot got done. And there's an agreement that we have to overhaul the tax code, basically focused on corporate taxes. So it could happen. It won't eliminate it, first of all, I'll tell you that. It's going to remain as the largest single tax deduction that's available to the average household. But it could go down to $500,000. It could get cut back. I don't expect that, but it could. It could. I don't want to outrule. They would do it in increments. We have our transition rules. That starts to get very complicated. But my sense is that second homes might be a place where it gets cut. There's a lot of possibilities there. Although second homes are really popular with congressmen because they all have to. So there's a lot of possibilities there. I don't think it's going to happen in the next couple years. And I think when it does happen, we're still going to be tax advantaged. But again, my whole feeling is that we should be tax advantaged. We should be hugely tax advantaged because there's a real value in creating homeownership opportunities, and this would be another cut on homeownership opportunities. If I can transition a little bit from your question, because I do want to get this off my chest, I'm much more concerned about what could happen to mortgages. That they would cut Fannie and Freddie to such a degree that mortgage capital would be so scarce that interest rates would go up, not because the interest rate environment is changing, but because there's no one in a position to lend for housing and for mortgages. That possibility I don't think will happen either in the next 2 years, but that actually worries me more, both in the short and the long run, than the deduction in mortgage interest rates. I think we have to, there's two things, that we're going to need everyone to get involved in. And you hit the mortgage interest deduction. The other one is going to be what happens to the FHA and the GSEs. Underwriting will get better. It's already starting to get better. I looked at it about a year and a half ago. I know this is hard to believe. I looked at it a year and a half ago, and the declination, I looked at declinations, loans that were declined, and the average FICO score was 745. Can you imagine that? On loans declined. I mean, and now that FICO score is down to 712, I think. So it's gotten better. But a 712 getting declined, that doesn't make any sense. It makes no sense. And lenders, again, my apologies to the lenders in the room. I know you guys don't make the policies, but lenders always do it wrong. You could have, if you didn't want to do underwriting, the time not to do any underwriting was 2 and 3 years ago. Because you were selling, the asset quality was so high. It was under the cost of producing it. Now, as we get a little more constrained on affordability, though, they need to loosen up, and they will. But we don't want them to go too loose. We do not want to repeat what happened in 2004, 5, and 6. We just don't want to go through that again. So I do think it's going to get better, but I think it's going to be a slow process. But I think by the end of next year, the actions taken by the FHFA just last week, I think you're going to start to see that in the marketplace pretty clearly. And again, I also think that Fannie and Freddie may have to sit down with the lenders and say, look, we're not going to do putbacks if you do this, this, and this, instead of leaving it completely open so they don't know what to do. Because if you leave it as open as they have, they're going to overreact. They're going to turn you down, or they're going to go through a paper. Anyone do a refinance recently? Anyone in this room? It's almost impossible for 1099 income people to do a refi, right? I mean, it's so painful. I don't have the chart here. I had a chart that said they'd rather spend a day in prison. The average American would rather spend a day in prison than do a refi. It's very painful, but it will get better, and I think it'll get better. It'll get noticeably better, but hopefully it doesn't get too easy either. Yes.
You just mentioned about Fannie and Freddie should do. What about FHA or the Federal Government?
Well, the FHA, and you guys know this better than I do, they have tightened up so much and put so much in terms of upfront fees that FHA is barely competitive with PMI at the moment. And the fact of the matter is they're reacting to what happened in 2008. When they shut down Fannie and Freddie and the lenders, FHA kept their original underwriting standards, and the market went crazy. So FHA in 2008 and 2009 got a very bad book of business. And that book of business put them underwater for the first time in their history. So they reacted by raising fees, making the underwriting more difficult. They're now going to react, I think. Remember they used to have an anti-flipping rule, and they waived that for a while. They're going to put back in the anti-flipping rule. Everything they're doing is shutting the door at FHA from my standpoint. I think we've got a new commissioner coming. The old commissioner happens to be a California affordable housing person. I was very disappointed. I spent a lot of time with her. I've known her for years. I was very disappointed in her, her reign at the FHA. I'm hoping the new commissioner will be more reasonable, because the FHA should be doing more at this point, and it's a good time to lend. It's a safe time to lend. Right? As long as you underwrite. The FHA underwriting, you make it through the FHA underwriting, the normal underwriting, forget everything else. You're a person who you should take a chance on with a 3% down payment. And, I think we've got a lot of education to do. And again, we have a very hostile Congress. That's part of this. The Republicans on the Financial Service Committee do not believe in the FHA. They want a completely level playing field. They don't want any money being directed towards housing. That's their political philosophy, and it shows in the FHA. So I don't know that was a good enough answer, but I think it will get better. It can't get tighter, and it doesn't need to get tighter, because they'll start to be in the black again, from a financial standpoint. Yes? Here or there? LA. I think it's starting to soften now. The number of investors is going down slowly but surely. I actually think, as I said earlier, I think I'm a conservative type of guy. I don't think you should, as an investor, if you're making a bet on future appreciation, that's a risky bet. Not that it won't happen, because it almost always happens in California, right? But you should be looking at cash-on-cash return. And a lot of these companies, the big investment entities, who basically have turned themselves into REITs and who trade on Wall Street with the portfolios that they've acquired, they have to do that. So they're going to come out of the marketplace. What you're going to confront in LA and in lots of the state, coastal parts of the state mostly, is going to be also foreign investors. People want to get out. I'm sure you ran into that. They don't trust their governments. I think as bad as our government is, you can generally trust them. They're not going to one day take your property away from you. But if you live in China, you're not so sure about that. Or you live in Indonesia, and you're, so you want to send your kids to school in the United States, and you want to have a property in the United States. So that's what you're confronting. But I do think it'll diminish. I think there's just not going to be that much cash around looking in the future. A lot of it's because interest rates, again, on investments are so low. Everyone wants to put it in housing, but it's already getting better, but it's very frustrating for first-time buyers. It's an incredibly difficult environment for first-time buyers. One of the programs we actually, through our Housing Affordability Fund, looked at was actually paying sellers. We decided not to do this, to allow the home to be bought by a first-time non-cash buyer. That's how desperate we were in some instances. And Fresno, the association, has done that and to try to address it. I don't think that works in the long run, obviously, but it's a very frustrating situation. And again, part of it is educating. Part of it is educating the sellers. It's always easier, and it's us too, right? It's it's a better bet to do an all-cash deal. You can't blame anyone for taking it. On the other hand, if you got a well-qualified buyer, maybe it's something we can talk to people about doing, because it's the right thing to do. That's why many of you you wrote those letters, right, on why they wanted the house, and I've seen that happen a lot. It happened with my kids. My kids had worse offers, and in both instances, very considerate sellers said, "I want you in there. I know it's not my best deal, but I want you in this house." And so it works both ways. It's a very tough environment. You guys know this better than I do, but it will get better. It's not going to continue this way. It's just too overheated. There were a couple of other questions. Yes, sir. I'll get back to you. I'm sorry? Shadow inventory. No, there never was. There was a little bit of holdback because they couldn't process. They couldn't process the loans well early on in 2009 through 11, and every time we'd hear, "Oh, come January, all this stuff's going to hit the marketplace." That was never the case. Now there are foreclosures still out there, but they're really in places like New Jersey and Florida and places like that. California, we have non-judicial foreclosure. And so we can get this stuff through the process. Sometimes it seems like it takes forever. But you know, in New Jersey, the average home going to foreclosure is over 4 years because it's got to go through a judicial process. And in Florida, I think it's three and a half years. So we're not going to, if there is shadow inventory, it's not really in California, but they'll discover some stuff. You know, the lenders, you know, they got people living in houses after the foreclosure notice still, you know, I hear this all the time for 16, 18 months. And when I ask them about it, they just said, it's a paperwork problem, but there's not a lot of it. That's the exception now. Now, I think the normal rate of foreclosure and distress sales will always be between 4 and 8%. We're getting pretty close to that. In most markets, it'll be less than 4%, but in Central Valley, it's always been between 5 and 8%, quite frankly. So you're getting closer to that now. So we're getting back to a normal market and all that means. Yes, anything else? Okay, Jeannie, I'll get you next. Go ahead.
Varying times, a person finalizes a short sale or foreclosure, when do they qualify?
It really does depend, but it's two or 3 years are the key benchmarks. You know, and again, the lenders have been a little bit reluctant. On short sales in particular, there's a 2-year one on the FHA. There's a 3-year one on the GSEs. Depending on how it goes, if they declare bankruptcy with it, that extends it. So it's a complicated answer. But the great majority, I just saw a statistic on this. The great majority of people who foreclosed should be eligible by the end of next year. It's like 65% of them will be eligible by the end of next year. Now, whether they're in a position financially to enter the marketplace, you know, is a different question. But they will be technically eligible. Jeannie? I don't see a lot of change there, unfortunately. Sorry. I don't see a lot of change there, unfortunately. I do think appraisers are getting better. They've figured it out. They always miss the turns with appraisers. Again, I don't want to offend anyone, but you know, it's like economists. I have a 100% record because I'm 6 months late on declaring the start of a recession. I'm 6 months late on saying it's over. You know, so I'm 100%, and it's the same way with appraisers, right? You know, they're always late on getting the turns. So I think in this kind of a marketplace, it's more predictable, and I'm hearing better things. But there's still certainly a shortage of appraisers in a sense, or at least a shortage of appraisers people want to use because they actually want to get paid. So they're using the out-of-area appraisers to some degree, although that seems to have come down. The lenders, we did a couple things to slap the lenders for using out-of-area appraisers, and it seems to work. But let me ask the question. Are you still seeing a lot of out-of-area appraisers here? A lot of them? Not as many, yeah, because we did stuff to really make that harder. The quality, well, you can't blame, you know, the appraisers are getting paid. You know, the AMC thing was the biggest hoax in the world because all that did is create another revenue source for the larger banks mostly and for title companies. And it is the appraisers now have fewer places to directly sell their appraisals, so their income has stayed flat to even gone down in some instances. So it's not a good situation, but I don't see a lot of impetus to change it. If you get general Dodd-Frank changes, that might be a place where it occurs, but I'm not optimistic about that. Thank you all very much. Best of luck to you.